When I started this video, it was not about cutting miters, and it was not about jigs and fixtures for the shop. This video was supposed to be about making and installing the trim in my new kitchen cupboard. I finished the doors about 2 weeks ago, and this week I was going to cut some lovely rounded profiles, install them in the cabinet, and be done. Except, doing that, well, you gotta cut a bunch of miters to get everything lined up at the corners. And listen, I can cut a 45-degree angle freehand with a saw. Anybody can, it's not difficult. But you do need a line to follow. And if you've got a curved surface, well, it can be really hard to draw a nice straight line across that. So I guess that's why woodworkers invented the miterbox, which I completely hate. Those clumsy, dusty old contraptions with the slots all wallowed out from years of sawing. They're hard to use, they're not accurate, and I am not making one of those things. But it would be helpful to have, just something, just to get things lined up and keep them square. So maybe I could take a couple pieces of wood, very, very simple, just put them together, put a couple of saw cuts in, and that would be enough to get me through the project. So I did that. And then things spiraled utterly out of control. Let's be clear. I like miter boxes just fine, as long as we're talking about this kind. Find me a big old cast iron Stanley miter box with built-in clamps, ball-bearing guides, and a massive, absurd distant miter saw. And, well, that's a totally different story. These old beasts actually work great. I've got one, and I use it. But this is woodwork for humans, and I don't use any tool unless it's commonly available and affordable. So, what's the minimum that we could throw together for a nice, repeatable little miter jig? Well, how about we start with a scrap of 2x4? We can dress it square, and that will make a great fence. For the base, we'll just use this piece of kitchen cabinet that I pulled out of the trash. We can do a quick layout by eye and get our dimensions. I'm moving way too fast for a long rip cut, so I'll just split off the part I need and plane it down to the line with my scrub plane. For the cross cut, I'm going with my Ryoba saw. With its fine teeth and no spine, it can do a long cross cut without all the splintering I'd get from a bigger saw. I'm leaning more towards Western tools these days, but I'm keeping my Ryoba. I'm laying out the cuts with a square across the top of the piece, and then carrying those lines across the faces. Then I'll chisel out a knife wall to guide my saw and saw a shallow kerf across the top and both faces. Then, when I know where the fence is going, I can use my Stockman knife to mark out my screw locations, and that's going to keep my fasteners out of the way when I saw these cuts. Then I can run my countersinks, drill all my holes, and spread on my glue. I've got a bunch of plane shavings around, so I use one of those. With the fence clamped on, I can flip the whole thing and rest it between the edge of the bench and the top of my vise, while I run my holes up into the fence and run in my fasteners. I generally use my bit brace for this kind of thing, but this is a fast jig, so I grab the power tools. Now the jig is awkward to try and hold in the vise, but my joiner's bench has a lot of holding options. I can knock up my planing stop and grab the other end with a holdfast. That's why I left that lip behind the fence. It gives a lot of places to hold the jig. Now I can run those saw cuts down, and that's no problem. As long as I don't suddenly hear the sickening grinding sound of my newly sharpened saw hitting a piece of metal. Good thing I was so careful in placing all those screws. Good thing I kept them where I wouldn't hit them with the saw, because that would be terrible. With the fence and base made, I just added a little riser, which lets you angle the saw down towards the handle as you cut. And then I thought I should saw the angles into that riser because that would give me a reference line for keeping things straight while I cut. So I dropped my crosscut saw into the kerf and struck lines on both sides. And those lines let me carefully bring the saw cuts across the base so that both my miter angles are easier to see and you can line that saw up no problem. Now I'm almost done and I'm not getting involved in some complicated project. Really. But then I did get to thinking, there's nothing that's going to keep those slots I just cut from getting all chewed up over time. Then they're going to be all loosey-goosey and the jig is going to be totally inaccurate, and then what's the point of all that marking and measuring and careful cutting I just did? It'll all be ruined. But then I thought, the folks at Veritas have a very interesting solution to this problem. They've come up with this set of Delrin guide blocks that you can install in a plain wooden miter box, and they keep the saw blade from chewing up the wood, and they're adjustable, so as things go out of square over time, you can tighten them back up and shift angles. It's a really clever idea, but I am not spending $16 on those. But what if instead I did the same thing with some plain blocks of polyethylene? I know, what? Polyethylene. It is a super common household plastic. You've got bottles and jars and packages in your house made of this stuff, and it's a great material because it's very slick, very low friction. Now, you probably don't have blocks of it sitting around, but that's no problem. Go down to the dollar store, buy the biggest plastic cutting board you can find, and you will have enough polyethylene for a lot of projects. The best part of this stuff is that you can work it with your regular tools. It's much softer than wood, and you can saw it, plane it smooth and square, mark it with your homemade gauge, and plane in some nice bevels because you don't want any sharp edges on your jigs. Then I'll clamp my ethylene block to the miter box, drill it, and add screws with washers. With your blocks installed, you can saw right through from the top, and you'll get the miter angle right on. I'll do that for both of my angles, and then, as long as I'm letting this project get totally out of control anyway, I might as well put blocks on top of the fence and saw through those too. Now I have a really tight and accurate jig. But as my saw chews it up and things get loose, I can adjust my plastic blocks to take up the slack. I made the screw holes oversized, so the blocks can slide back and forth and even pivot to adjust angles. This jig can stay accurate for years, and because I made it with only one fence, you can fit in boards of almost any size and cut miters vertically or horizontally. The thick rear fence and the guide blocks make it run true, especially if you use the cuts in the riser to keep things aligned. When you're cutting small stock, you can also angle the saw into the riser and get a really accurate cut. Now, the miters I get here are really good. They're definitely good enough for fixing some trim around the house or putting moldings on a big cabinetry project. But, they're not perfect. And if you cut one a 1/16 of an inch too long, you're kind of screwed because they're really difficult to trim. As long as this project has gotten totally out of hand anyway, we're going to build one more jig. It's called a miter shooting board, and it's going to let us use a common hand plane to square up and perfect and trim those miters to make them just right. And it really is a simple jig. This time, I actually mean that. Make your miter shooting board out of scrap plywood or MDF to make it cheap and stable. You need 2 half-inch pieces for the base and a chunk of thicker stuff for the fence. I've got a good set of plans with all the dimensions. The plane is going to ride against this edge here, so it needs to be really straight. And don't worry, you can plane plywood just fine. Notice that I'm pinching the toe of my plane to keep the blade centered on the wood, and I'm checking the edge with a good metal straight edge. I need a base for my jig, and I'm using another scrap of ply for that. Luckily, my cheap hardpoint saw is made for construction work, and it goes right through plywood. No problem. Just like any other wood, I can shoot the end of this ply for a square edge, but I'm using my scrub to get it done faster. Now, you need to glue the narrow piece with the jointed edge down to the base. I'm using a few grains of salt to keep the pieces from sliding around in the glue, and I'm spreading the clamping pressure with a hardwood caul. This keeps everything flat as the glue dries. Dry glue on this edge is going to keep my plane from tracking, so I clean up all the squeeze out with a sharp scrap of hardwood, and I let the whole thing dry for at least an hour while I make the fence. For your fence, it's really helpful if you've got something with a factory corner. Then you can just cut that corner off and you have a perfect 90-degree angle. This offcut is really close to square, but it's just a little high on one side. I'll color it in with pencil and concentrate my planing strokes on the high end before I take some passes over the whole edge. You really can get a perfect right angle with hand tools. You just need to be patient. Once you have your corner, cut it off with your coarse saw. You want it to hang over your narrow piece a bit, because a sharp corner is going to be fragile and crumple under the weight of the plane. So let it overhang about an inch, and cut it with the Ryoba to stay close to the line and minimize splintering. I use glue with a bit of salt again, and I double check my fence with a couple of squares. I want a dead-on 45-degree angle on each side. I use a clamp with a caul again, and give it an hour to dry. Then I add 3 screws and countersunk holes to lock it down for good. I'd like to use this shooting board in the vise, so I'll add a cleat underneath. Just screws is fine. Then I can drop it into my vise and use the plane to trim the tip of that fence. You'll need to do it from both sides to get it really flush and square. Then you're done. No, seriously, you're actually done. We're not adding strips of Teflon or anything like that. This is it. Here's how you make it work. The trick with mitering jigs is using them to cancel out any error. So I like to pencil a number 1 on one piece and a 2 on the second piece of any miter. You could cut both these on the same side of the miter box, but then if there's any error in that angle, you're going to be doubling it when you assemble the two pieces. Using both angles minimizes error, and you can always use our adjustable blocks to true up any side of the jig that has problems. Over on the miter shooting board, it's the same thing. I've got my pieces numbered, and I'm going to be sure to use one side of the jig for each piece. I can't be positive that my fence is exactly the same on each side, but I was careful to start with a perfect 90-degree corner. It could be that one side is closer to 44 degrees, but then the other side will be 46 degrees. They add up to 90, so using one side of the jig for each side of the joint cancels out any error. And this joint really is perfect. I could do a picture frame with this thing, no problem. So clearly, I got a little sidetracked on this project, but I'm kind of glad I did. Furniture makers need to cut miters. They need to be repeatable and they need to be accurate. The miter box really helps with that, but even a good miter needs to be trimmed and squared up, and for that, you really need to have a miter shooting board. So I'm not sorry I made them. If you've got both of these jigs and they're tuned up and running right, you can make your miters perfect. And I don't use that word lightly, but perfection is possible with this, even with hand tools. Now, you might want to make these two jigs, and I have got a fantastic set of plans. They are very accurate and very affordable, and you can grab those by going to rexkruger.com/store or clicking the link down in the description. My store has a lot of affordable plans and even a set of free plans that you can just have. And I get the flexibility to make things inexpensive and even free because of my patrons on Patreon. They provide the support that lets me keep prices down and even give things away for free once in a while. And beyond that, they're also a great community. We have this fantastic discussion board, and my patrons have gone crazy with that thing. They are on the board every day, asking questions and talking about tools. I'm hardly ever on the thing, and they don't care. They don't need me. They're like, oh, you go make the videos. We'll just talk about stuff. We'll answer each other's questions. It's fine. Go make your little videos. I'm like, awesome, okay. It's really fun. And if you would like to be one of the people who gets to participate in that conversation, it's easy. Just go on over to patreon.com/RexKruger and check out the early access, rewards, and exclusive benefits that I give to the people who make this stuff possible. Oh, and don't forget to sign up for my free e-newsletter, Fabrication First. It comes out on the 1st of every month, and it is packed full of interesting, real tips and articles. I'm not going to try and market a bunch of stuff. It is really spam-free. It's just something I want to do for my viewers. You can click the link down in the description to sign up for that. And I'm going to be back next week where I swear to God I am going to make and attach the trim on my cupboard and finally finish that project off. I hope you'll join me. Thanks for watching.